Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. Today we are continuing to discuss Borges' short story, The Garden of Walking Paths. We had done a close reading of the short story in the previous session. Today we continue to look at some of the other important aspects which have also informed our understanding of the story. If you ask what kind of a story this is, it's difficult to find a single straightforward answer. It is at large a self-referential and deceptive text. The ambiguity which is part of the text, whether it is on purpose or whether it has been built in inadvertently, is perhaps not easy to decipher. And the ambiguity rests right from the basic question about who the narrator is, whether the narrator is the manuscript editor or Yusun or the author figure of Borges. It's difficult for us to know. And how the elements of history and fiction fuse in this story together, that also becomes another source of ambiguity. And there's no single meaning that this story gives out. We only have multiple interpretations. Which version is right? Whose story is right? Who's telling the truth and who's not? These are some of the questions that would continue to haunt us even after we finish reading the story. There are several layers that this story has. There is a straightforward spy story which is part of it, and that could be seen as the outer box or the outer layer of the story. There are multiple boxes and layers inside Sui Pen's novel and the many things which are part of its narration in the beginning, its resurrection by Stephen Albert. Those are many layers and many boxes within which we can find multiple narrative possibilities and certain personal details that our narrator uses and shares with us about the choice of his profession and how he is embarking on such a mission. And towards the end, about the infinite penitence and grief that he is facing, which is unknown to the rest of the world. Those are certain other things which would perhaps give us other layers and other possibilities of looking at the story. This has also been seen as one of the earliest hypertext kind of narration, and interestingly this is a story which can be easily translated into a hypertext version as well. And as we had mentioned in the earlier lecture, this is a story which is said to have predated the event of postmodernism. So we do find a number of postmodern elements such as ambiguity and fragmentation and hypertextual references as part of this narration. There are a number of elements of uncertainty which we find from the beginning till the end of the text. There are certain elements of uncertainty which are built into the storyline. For example, the kind of uncertainty that Yusun faces about his life, even when he begins to tell us about the series of events that began to follow after his cover as a spy was exposed. The uncertainty when Yusun feels when he is being pursued by Madden, or the uncertainty that he feels when he is making the choice and after having made the choice, when he is awaiting his death sentence, the many ambiguous feelings that he has within him. These are certain uncertain elements which are built into the story. And even otherwise, there are many uncertain things, many ambiguous things, even bordering onto certain absurdity. For instance, the ethnicity of Yusun and the fact that he is working for the Germans. Those are certain absurd magic realist things which critics have noticed in this story. This is a story which expects the reader's co-participation. Without the reader participating in this story as someone who's trying to solve the puzzle, or as someone who's trying to make sense of the many layers and the many boxes which are part of the story, the reading of the story is not complete. This is definitely the kind of a story which expects a reader. There is an implied reader who is either participating in the making of the story or trying to unravel the mystery that the story is. Borges himself had referred to the story as a detective story. In one of his interviews titled Conversations, the interviewer asks him about this story, The Garden of Walking Paths, and he says, I think it's quite good as a detective story. Interviewer says that it's more than a detective story though, and this is the ambiguous explanation that Borges gives. Well, it should be, because after all, I had Chesterton behind me and Chesterton knew how to make the most of a detective story. He sticks to this notion that this is a detective story, but just like the interviewer knows, the reader as well as Borges himself knows that there is more to this than a mere detective story. But this outer layer of a detective story, this outer layer of a spy story, makes the mystery all the more profound, accentuates the notion of mystery, accentuates the kind of mystery which is part of this story. We have noted earlier that the genre of detective fiction, though it was a popular medium, it was often looked down upon as a literary inferior. It did not have the literary merit or the philosophical profoundness like most other well-known canonical fiction had. And what made this kind of writing, the genre of detective fiction, extremely popular was that it was easy to read, and it also required the clue gathering and puzzle solving skills. So, as a medium, as a genre, it was something that challenged the reader. Here we find Borges making use of this medium, the genre of detective story, to narrate a tale which will be challenging for the reader, where the reader is required to gather the clues and solve the puzzle that is part of the story. The reader is the detective here, and that is what makes The Garden of Walking Paths a different kind of a detective story. We do not have a detective within the story trying to solve the puzzle or trying to resolve the mystery. Right at the outset, when we find this yellow man working as a spy for the Germans and that he is currently being pursued by an Irishman in England, when we are given this setting, the reader automatically assumes the position of a detective, and the reader goes on to solve this puzzle, solve the mystery. And what is the nature of the mystery over here? When we look at the story as a whole, in totality, the way it is presented tells us that there is no mystery over here. It's in the form of a deposition. It's not in the conventional form of a detective story where there is a form of a suspense which is there hanging in the air right at the outset of the narration. Here we are given to understand by the interventions of the manuscript editor or the history writer that this is his story, the solution, the resolution of which we already know of. So, the nature of mystery itself is challenging and ambiguous over here, and towards the end, when a brief spell of suspense is broken, we are able to together make sense of the many things that Yusun had been feeling, or even perhaps question some of the things that Yusun had been trying to share with us. And how would you classify the different details that you find in the story? Is it part of fiction? Is it history? Or is it a manuscript editor? Remember the footnote that we find at the end of the story, where there is a kind of a corrective information given about the death of Victor Runeberg. Is this tale, the form of narration, is it something else other than fiction, history, or manuscript? Is it like a researched paper? Again, there is no single answer to it. This story, The Garden of Walking Paths, it is at some level all of these rolled together into one, and at another level none of these. When the story is being positioned as a detective story, when multiple elements of suspense and mystery are introduced into it, we are also given to understand this is not just about time and the mystery that is part of the narrative. it is also about the making of fiction. Here, in the form of a detective story, within the frameworks of a detective story, when Borges is introducing to us certain elements of fiction, some elements of history, some elements of manuscript, and some elements of research, he is actually questioning the rules of fiction. It's very typically postmodern. This is a self-referential text which is consciously questioning the ways in which stories are written and deliberately trying to write a story which does not present itself as a story, but nevertheless carries a label of a detective fiction. So, in terms of this questioning that Borges does, it is slightly complicated. And there are critics who have even wondered whether this can be seen more like a philosophical treatise masquerading as a detective story, because we do find a lot of discussions about future, about time, about choices, about certain relationships within which men and women are required to make difficult decisions, and the impossibility of making two different decisions at the same time, and the fictional possibility of occupying or inhabiting different physical spaces and different time slots at the same time. So, it is many things rolled into one, but for convenience sake, for simplifying the nature of the story, perhaps it is also called as a detective story by Borges himself. Let us now quickly recall the plot line and the major things that we discussed when we read the story closely in the previous session. So, we have at the center of narration Yusun, who can be considered as the narrator and the protagonist of this story. There are multiple identities which he possesses. He is Chinese, he was an English professor, he is currently working as a German spy. He is also the ancestor and the great grandson of Sui Pen. That is his connection with Sui Pen and the Garden of Walking Paths, the title which the story also bears. Garden of Walking Paths, we get to know it is a novel written by Sui Pen. So, through Yusun, we are introduced to Sui Pen and also the Garden of Walking Paths, which is the name of the novel, and we are also introduced to a letter which Albert has, which Dr. Albert has, but it is written by Sui Pen, and there is an idea of this garden itself which Albert recreates, which originally was the brainchild of Sui Pen. And there is Albert. Albert sort of functions as a mediator between Yusun and Sui Pen, and he serves multiple roles here. One, he is the person who introduces Sui Pen's ambiguous scheme of things, scheme of this novel and the garden to Yusun. He is the one who demystifies what this garden signifies, and at the same time he is chosen not for any profound reasons, but for the simple reason that his name is Albert. And this is how the story oscillates between very profound philosophical things and certain simple things which just act as happy accidents or as certain conveniences. And when we talk about Albert, he also has these different slots that he occupies. It is a name of a town because of which he gets chosen, because Yusun had to convey the name of a town by murdering this man. The name Albert makes its appearance first in the story through a name found on a telephone book. He is also a sinologist. And we have another character, Richard Madden, who is Irish. He is an English spy. He is currently pursuing Yusun. And in this complicated scheme of things, we are introduced to certain other notions of the concept of time, the idea of elaborance, and this framework of this being a spy story. And to make things more complicated and complex, we also have these rivalries between German spy and English spy, and also about the idea of betrayal, the idea of choice, the idea of loyalties to particular nations and how nations become more significant than individuals and humans. These are many, many possible and complicated things which this story introduces to us. We have already taken a detailed look at the story. I do hope that these references make a lot of sense for you. Coming back to the title of this work, Garden of Forking Paths. It's a title of the short story. It is the title of this novel that Swayam wrote and Albert recreated. There is also this real garden which Swayam aspired to create. This reference to this imaginary book written by Swayam, that's a narrative trope that we find Borges using in many of his literary exercises. And he has spoken at length about this idea of imaginary books that he uses. In Borges' own words, the composition of vast books is a laborious and impoverishing extravagance. To go on for 500 pages, developing an idea whose perfect oral exposition is possible in a few minutes. A better course of procedure is to pretend that those books already exist and then to offer a resume, a commentary, more reasonable, more inept, more indolent. I have preferred to write notes upon imaginary books. This is what Borges is doing in this story. He presents this as a convenient technique, a convenient fictional trope that he is using. He is talking about this imaginary book written by Swayam and recreated by Dr. Albert, and Borges uses his power as the author to give notes on these imaginary creations. And about the idea of the labyrinth, it's a recurrent image in most of Borges' stories. He has written an entire collection of stories and essays titled Labyrinth, published in 1962. In the story, The Garden of Forking Paths, which of these elements best constitute, best represent the idea of a labyrinth? Is it the forking paths in Swayam's novel or the forking paths leading to Dr. Albert? All of them are labyrinths. Once you get caught in this, like Yusun does, it's difficult to find one's way out. And there's only one way out. And these different forking paths, depending on which path you take, it'll take you to different endpoints and different destinations. In reality, the choices that Swayam made, or Dr. Albert made, or Yusun made, there is only one possible choice and one possible destination. But in the imaginary setting, which the labyrinth offers a possibility of talking about, it encompasses past and future extending to the stars. That's what the story tells us. Labyrinth in this story, it can be possibly inferred that it stands as an allegory for time. And Borges is talking about the possibility of occupying different time slots, the possibility of having different futures at the same time. The story itself also can be seen as a labyrinth where there are many narratives diverging and converging, and it can be read in different ways, which is why it's also easily translatable as a hypertext fiction. When you look at the story as a labyrinth and place Yusun at the center, we realize that there are different choices which are available for him. For example, right from the beginning, he can choose to surrender or go on to execute his mission, very well knowing that he is anyway going to be caught. And when he is going to Stephen Albert's house, again he has got two different choices. Either to kill Albert and convey the message to his chief in Berlin, or not to kill Albert, enjoy this newfound relationship and go into custody, walk on to his death sentence, feeling good about how well he behaved with Stephen Albert. But here we find him making this difficult choice of being loyal to the nation than being loyal to this one man whom he considers greater than Goethe, who had resurrected the work and life of his ancestor, his great-grandfather. And even at the end, he has two different choices available before us, either to tell us the truth, in the deposition, tell us the truth or not to tell us the truth. The beauty of this narration is that we have no way of knowing whether Yusun is actually telling us the truth or recreating another fictional story based on his figment of imagination. We find a reference to Newton and Schopenhauer in this story. There is a statement, in contrast to Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not think of time as absolute and uniform. This ancestor is Swayam, the one who wrote this imaginary novel. The reference is to Einstein's theories refuting Newton's theories of time. Borges was infinitely fascinated by the idea of relativity, which Einstein proposed, and it is said that Mr. Albert is a character modeled after Einstein. Here we find Borges making a comparison between scientific theory and fictional framework and presenting it as if it's a most commonplace thing to do. Critics have remarked that there's a way in which you can compare quantum theory to Borges' tale, and also there have been multiple references to Schrodinger's cat, where it was a thought experiment, as most of you know. It talks about how two outcomes can be interpreted as occurring in alternate universes with equal validity. The question is whether the cat is alive or dead, and both the possibilities, both outcomes have equal validity and equal possibility of occurring in alternate universes. And Borges we find rejecting linear or absolute time, and again we find him trying to fit this fictional framework within the many things which are happening in terms of science and new inventions and discoveries of those times. And this is again a postmodern possibility which Borges begins to explore from the 1940s onwards, much before post-structuralism and postmodernism came into vogue and practice. A small footnote which is given at the end of the story, which also offers a certain corrective information about the death of Victor Runeberg, one of the other spies who was also working for Germany along with Yusun. This footnote has a significant role to play here. It makes us wonder whether Borges wants to place this story within a non-fiction report. It also draws our attention to the narrator, who in this case is a manuscript editor, and he is standing right behind Yusun, editing, excising, adding, modifying. So we really have no way of knowing whether this is really Yusun's version or whether this has been modified for whatsoever reason. And we also find Borges himself emerging here as a writer, and he is standing right behind the narrator, the manuscript editor, and he is the one who is manipulating and formulating the plot, introducing characters, making them make certain decisions or not letting them to do certain things. He is the one who is influencing the setting. So there is a narration inside the narration, and the footnote can be seen as an inner narration. It's drawing our attention to many non-fictional elements within something which is presented to us as a fiction. So ultimately, this act of introducing the footnote, the manuscript editor, and these historical references and corrective information, all of this amounts to confusing the fiction of the story, which is what Borges perhaps tries to do. And again, the question that we began to wonder about, even Yusun's account may not be trustworthy. He is a spy, he can manipulate things, and he's used to living convincing lives undercover. And at this turning point, where if we are to believe the story, the ultimate mission that he lives out is to convey the name of the city to his chief in Berlin. The story tells us that his ultimate loyalty rests with his occupation as a spy. It's all about conveying the right kind of information to the one who had commissioned him. So even if we begin to wonder whether his accounts are trustworthy, it could not be entirely refuted. Before we wind up this lecture, I want you to be familiar with one of the ways in which this story can be read in the postmodernist framework. Deleuze and Guattari spoke about the idea of rhizomes, and rhizomes can be explained like this. Unlike a top-down structure of a tree, rhizomes have a fairly organic kind of growth and existence. It's difficult to find where it has a starting point and where it ends. Unlike the tree where there are these definite roots that you can identify, here we find that it is an extension and there are no entry or exit points. And there is no way in which we can say this is the limit. The dimensions cannot really be predicted or be framed. Rhizomes have a kind of an organic existence where one thing leads to the other. So, this is a theoretical framework which Deleuze and Guattari introduced, and rhizomes were useful to talk about in many postmodern elements and possibilities. This story also in that sense has multiple entry and exit points. There are no hierarchies or binaries. It is difficult to say whether, for instance, Usen's character is superior to Albert or Madden's character is inferior to Usen. And again, with this intervention of the manuscript editor, we even begin to suspect whether Usen is telling us the right thing about Victor Runeberg, whether we are being forced to look at Madden from a different light because the story is being told to us through the eyes of Usen. So, there are no hierarchies or binaries. There are no single entry points and exit points. There are multiple ways in which we can enter the story, different kinds of interpretations, and then we can look at them in whichever way we want and exit from whichever point we want. So, the idea of the rhizome, which can be used to talk about this story, it talks about this postmodern, decentralized and kinetic worlds, and this story has been seen as one of the perfect examples of this postmodern, decentralized and kinetic worlds which are introduced within the framework of fiction. As remarked earlier, this is a story which offers multiple interpretative possibilities. So, there could be other ways of looking at this work. There could be other frameworks which could be used to analyze this. I leave you with those possibilities. I thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you in the next session.